Alright, so let's move on to part 2, the second day of the miniseries, and the least popular, it seems in a lot of cases, in both the miniseries and the book, as we mentioned in the last video. But, yeah, as I said, I just really kind of have a full appreciation for the full story, so we'll just go into it right from here exactly the way that it does. Before, though, on the whole debate on does it matter if it's actually scary or not, to the audience anyway. And there was one thing that I forgot. I was gonna bring it up in the last video, and then I got distracted. I think started talking about Tim Curry's performance, but yeah, the other thing that did genuinely get to me when I saw this as a child and decided to watch it alone because I assumed that it couldn't be that scary, being a TV movie with a clown in it. And that, of course, is Georgie's winking picture, which, if you just say that, sort of sounds like just some sort of campfire story type scare, not something that would, like, genuinely get to you. But the way that you see it also, and I've heard also, it was another one of those cases where we're talking about it sort of pushing the envelope for what TV movies end up showing later on, that was sort of an effect that people in 1990 didn't really expect to see in a TV movie, and sort of caught everybody off guard. And then the whole blood coming out of the picture from behind. And it's at that point, and this is the reason I can't believe I forgot to mention it yesterday, I actually turned it off for a while. I think it wasn't until the next day I decided, it's daytime now, I can go back to it. So yeah, as far as the scary versus not scary debate, as far as like 10-year-old or so me saw it, I got a full like 12 minutes in. But yeah, then after the fact, it becomes more of a, it just depends on the person and the individual scene and stuff like that we talked about yesterday, so we can go on now, now that that's out of the way. So, in talking about it at least having, maybe if not so much a scary vibe, certainly a creepy vibe, especially when it starts right away in the second part, because I try to be in the mindset of the people in 1990 when this aired, which was the year I was born, so I wasn't one of them, so I have to imagine it. The fact that it obviously kind of had a bit of a slow build-up, at least a little bit. We got a little bit of character work before we went into all of the directing. Yeah, we had the scene with Lori and stuff like that and George, but for the most part, there was a lot of character build-up. And in this, we've already established all the characters, so this can just be right there. But it starts off with this scene that could be a little small bit of character, and everything sort of slowing down and being more about the emotion than the scares, where Bill goes to visit George's grave. And you're not really expecting anything to hit, like, right away, like in the first few seconds, because you're somebody in 1990, you're sitting down for the second night of this, which there was a night in between, I think. It was one night, then there wasn't, and then the second night. And then you sit down and you're kind of waiting for, you know, there's going to be character and build-up and all that. But no, it's like barely 60 seconds in, and Pennywise is already showing his face again. Just like that. And the whole sort of genuinely creepy, I think, setup, where he's got the 7 graves all lined up for them. And then he says, oh, hold on, you can't have the one at the end because it's already taken. And of course we know, because of the very last moment of part 1, that that's Stan. But Bill doesn't know this yet. And so that whole sort of thing, I always thought that was like a really eerie way to introduce the way he tortures Bill in just the right place, also when he was in such an emotional state, as all the memories of George are coming back to him in this moment. And that's when Pennywise hits him. It's like the sort of sadistic vibe of it comes out of him too in that particular instance. I also like the idea of the fact that I didn't think about this until I read somebody talking about it somewhere, and it was the fact that in this little vision that Pennywise has set up for Bill, Stan's grave is marked with a cross, despite the fact that he's Jewish. And it's like, you could not really take that as anything. You just take it as 7 graves and one's filled in, and the cross means nothing more than somebody dead is buried here. But it could also be like mocking Stan in a way. So I think there's kind of something to that, I think, that kind of continues on with that. But one thing I did want to touch on real quick that I do think, because a lot of this has been me sort of saying what the series does great, especially the ways in which it adapts the novel. There is something about the whole series that I do feel like it could have handled maybe a little better or a little more clear. Maybe they were trying to be subtle with it and didn't want to get too exposition heavy with it, but I do think it probably, viewers going into this that weren't familiar with the book, may have a hard time buying the whole, them not having memories of this thing. And I remember the first time I saw it before I'd read the book, I thought, like, exactly what Bill says in part 1 when he remembers George, and he's like, you know, how could I have possibly forgotten that? And the way that, as they each come back to Derry, and the memories kind of slowly come back, and there's even that moment at the restaurant when Eddie says, I don't know what you guys are talking about. And it's like, at first you think he's just in denial. Like, he's just trying to say, nope, nothing's wrong here, so I can leave. Until you know the story and realize that there's something, whether it be something supernatural with it or something supernatural with Derry itself, but the way that whenever somebody leaves Derry, it, like, physically erases their mind. And they only get it when they come back, which is why Mike is the one that remembers everything, because he never left. And so they do seem to explain portions of that throughout the series, but I still think it's a little unclear enough that some viewers may think like it's sloppy storytelling or something. Just, oh, they just forgot. And it's like it maybe doesn't imply quite enough that there's something supernatural as to why they don't remember anything. So, but you know, they do touch on it in some ways. So there is that, and it probably would have. It probably does have a better effect than, say, you know, just dumping all of it in exposition or something like that. Because even they aren't entirely sure that's what it is. They just kind of deal with it as it comes or goes. So, going on the idea of Pennywise setting up a grave that could potentially have been mocking Stan's religion, is the fact that you go into this and you realize that, with it being split up into two parts, because you got the first part where they're children. So, the stuff that he's going to... So, Pennywise's idea to kind of get under their skin and get the fear into them and salt the meats, as he keeps saying in the book, he's going to scare them in ways that, you know, using the stuff out of movies or whatever he can find that makes them afraid, but especially that one particular thing that really gets to them. And it's a little different when they're adults, so he, like, adapts how he's going to get that out of them and get that feeling out of them. So you'll notice... when he's torturing them as adults, particularly, there's a lot of changes in this part in the miniseries as far as the book goes, but I actually think they're really good changes. I'm not saying necessarily one's better than the other, but I like the way that the series sort of played off the stuff that we already know about them, when we know is already sort of in each character's psyche, because instead of seeming to want to use things to, like, scare them when they're adults, it's like he's just mocking them. And like he's just really getting under their skin as opposed to flat out scaring them. Now, of course, they get scared whenever they see him, because just in general it means, you know, it's back and they're seeing it for themselves and the memories flood back and all that. But what he's actually doing is just more so like he's sort of egging them on, like he's poking them in all the wrong places just to get to them. Because you've got the stuff like with Ritchie, where we have Ritchie going to the library instead of Ben like it was in the book. And it's like with Ben that made sense for him to go to the library because that's where he spent all of his time in the book. And we saw in the new movie as well. But this idea to have the marquee have Rest in Peace Richie Tozier on it in his dates is really cool. Not only because that's sort of got a creepy vibe to it in general, the look of it, and to imagine from Richie's point of view seeing that, which I'm thinking is a take on the book when he sees like the flyers for like the dead rock bands and all that. But what I like about it being on the movie marquee, the change that the series made, was that that's where Ritchie's like fear initially came from, was seeing the werewolf movie at the theater. So it makes sense that the theater is where he puts the words that like sort of call Ritchie out and put the fear back in him. And then, yeah, like I was saying, the whole library scene, when it seems like, you know, it's at this point the library scene where you can see people saying, like, oh, it's not scary at all. Actually, Pennywise is kind of funny. This particularly with how Tim Curry's playing the scene and just going all in as much as possible. But the thing here is that, yeah, it's like he's not necessarily trying to scare Ritchie, it's that he's, like, making fun of him for being a comedian. And so he's just making these really bad jokes and doing all this stuff, and it's like, yeah, and I just don't get the sense that there was any sort of, trying to really, really scare. And the most he does that is saying, get out while you still can. But then he goes right back into like his little comedy routine that's basically saying, "Fuck you, Ritchie. You're not worth any. You didn't become anything worthwhile," which he does to all of them. But then there's also, and yeah, going on the fact that we've changed where Ben goes from the library to now into the Barrens, which, if I remember correctly in the book, Mike had strictly said that because the Barrens kind of got to all of them, to not go to the Barrens, just to kind of walk around. And see if they, and just until it runs into them or they run into it and see what happens, just to sort of get back into it. But the thing about this that I really like, even before we talk about what Ben does, the whole way they've switched the order too, and what I really like as far as them coming into town and running into it, that gives it a different feel than it does in the book, is that in the book they meet at the Chinese restaurant first and then go their separate ways and then they run into everything. But I like the way they do it here, where they put the Chinese restaurant after they've all experienced it when they got here, because there's like an extra vulnerability. Like there's sort of that. It's like what Ritchie talks about in the series when they're at the restaurant. He's like, "This is like the first time I feel good after having already been through it. This is like our safety zone where we can be here." So it's like, after they've been together, there is a little something there that gives them the drive to be able to do this, and just like jump face first into it and like welcome confrontations with it. Whereas it's like there's more of a vulnerability when they're running into it just by themselves without having met up yet, not knowing who's going to be here and who isn't, or what they're walking into exactly. So I like the vibe that gives off, that we didn't get in the book because they had already met first. Like I said, not saying one is necessarily better than the other, but I like the way they did something different with it while still telling the same story and not going too far off. But also, like I was talking about, with the way they connect with the ways they're attacked, I feel like they're connected more in the ways in which they're attacked or tormented, I guess, in this than necessarily the book. Because I do like the idea of Ben going back to the Barrens, because that's where he saw, Pennywise posing as his dad. And we see, like, the skeleton that attacked him from the water we only saw in that little flash. And to see it standing upright is this really fucking crazy image that I've always liked, that always stuck with me. Just because skeletons are something that really bothers me. Like, if it was going to attack me, that's probably what it would become, as a fucking skeleton with all the individual bones and shit. That's the shit I can't do. So, and then, once again, and also the fact that that Ben is kind of attacked by a ghost, sort of like, or he sees a ghost sort of figuratively and literally. Because he obviously sees Pennywise there, but then there's also the figurative way of seeing a ghost when he sees the kid being chased by the bullies that looks a lot like the younger version of him. So I thought that was something that was handled really well, and was a good use of Ben going back to the Barrens instead of the library, which Ritchie got. And then there's something that makes almost too much sense, that I'm really surprised it's something that King didn't go with, and that is Eddie being tormented at the pharmacy. Which is kind of perfect. Like, they have the whole thing in the book where he's chased by, like, Patrick Hockstetter and Greta Bowie, I think her name was in the book. Because in the new movie, she's King's daughter, so they twisted that a little bit too. But she's a non-existent character in this, as far as I remember. Her name might be dropped once, but yeah, Eddie being chased around and the whole baseball thing and all that. Like I said, it's like his old fears coming back to get him. It's like, it also almost feels like him going to the pharmacy and getting tormented is also somewhat of a stand-in for the leper, because it's the whole thing of attacking Eddie with the idea of, just the idea of being sick in general, and whenever he needed something for that, it was always the pharmacy. So you can imagine what kind of place the pharmacy was to him, and to run into Keen again, and that's where it makes its move, is really just like, it's like the dominoes are perfectly set up and the miniseries just jumped on it. So I really like the way that was handled. And then, of course, obviously Bev wasn't going to get anything but the Mrs. Curse thing. Obviously they didn't have once again, they have their TV budget, so they didn't go the full Hansel and Gretel route. But I'll be really interested to see if the new movie does that. But in the meantime, yeah, I still think this scene is played pretty well also, particularly. It doesn't maybe have as much build-up as it probably should have, but once again, kind of on time constraints here because we've only got an hour and a half for each part. But still, the image of, like, when, like, Mrs. Kirsch takes the form of, like, her decomposing dad, that's pretty trippy in itself. Maybe not as trippy as the whole Hansel and Gretel thing, but once again, if you're on a TV budget, I think they made it work pretty well. Especially the actress playing Mrs. Kirsch and the way she was able to jump so quickly from, oh, you know, come on inside, we'll have tea, and then, oh, I'm actually fucking nuts, oh, I'm actually it. It just happens very quickly, but I do think it's sold really well also. So, and then, yeah, and then we finally get to the scene when we're at the Chinese restaurant and the fortune cookies come, and what I think is interesting about this, and a choice that they made, is leaving some stuff out of the series, but keeping stuff in with no context. That's, you know, tormenting them by what they're afraid of. With the others, obviously, it's the bugs like it was, and with Ritchie having the eye and Mike having the bird, and it's like, when I saw it before I read the book, I remember just thinking, oh, it's just disturbing things. And the bird seemed really out of nowhere, because it's like, oh yeah, bugs, oh yeah, whatever that is, claws or whatever. And then, oh yeah, an eyeball. And the bird just seemed like this whole fucked up level that sort of didn't match up with all the others. Like, he really went in on Mike. But of course, if you're aware of the story, you're aware of the eye thing with Ritchie and the bird thing with Mike, where Mike was attacked by a bird as both a baby and then the giant one when he first met it. But that's the thing. That's the interesting thing also, is the way it sort of, you see that and you're like, whoa, he really went in on Mike with the fortune cookie. And it's like, well, yeah, because we don't really see Mike personally attack the way we see the others do when they're adults. We barely do in the first part also, because the album thing happens to all of them. But yeah, so well, once again, though, we do understand there are time constraints, and the way they were able to work in some of that stuff were to go ahead and go with the fortune cookies and leaving everything in there, and it's like, even if we don't have the context of, like, how Ritchie feels about eyeballs and Mike with birds, there's still an effect there, even if it's not quite the effect if you know everything going into why that's what they saw. So I think that works. The same thing with one case where I don't think that works quite as well, where using the context of the book but just going with it without having the context in the series, is Kuntz, the guard, of course, the guard at the asylum with Henry. Where there's the whole thing where we're just really told in, like, one sentence in the book, because that's all we really need, and it's like, well, you know, Kuntz's entire childhood he was afraid of dogs, or that specific kind of dog, so that's what he goes after. It makes perfect sense. That's what it would be. But if you can put that together, you know enough about it and its functions and the way it works in the series by this point, but still, it just seems like, seeing the dog's head with the ruffled collar and the clown outfit and all that, it can seem pretty silly if you don't have the total and complete context of, yeah, it's like Kuntz's ultimate fear. But once again, you know, there's only so much you can do, so there it is. I also like that they added the quarters dropping to the ground, which he would use to, like, you know, keep the patients in place, as you also know from the book, so there is that. And then also talking about Mike only being attacked in, like, a group setting. It's also, if I remember correctly, I have to keep prefacing that because it's like there's so much in the book. I'm never quite sure if I'm remembering exactly as it is. When they see Stan's head in the refrigerator, if I was remembering correctly, was something in the book that only Mike saw. And so that was kind of his whole thing, and it was child Stan's head, because obviously he wouldn't know what Stan looked like now, which I thought was a really nice effect in the book, but they went ahead and gave Richard Masur another scene, because he's so high in the credits and recognizable. So we'll make an adult Stan's head, why not? But I do like the way, even though, once again, I feel like we're missing something here with Mike not getting a singled out attack, which is funny to say, because we know his ultimate fight with Henry Bauer, sure. But as far as being attacked by, you know, not just through Henry, there's, like, he does probably need that moment, but at the same time, I do think it also makes sense that they all see Stan said in the refrigerator, so they're all attacked by it. He just goes through and just roasts all of them, which once again plays into it's half Pennywise scaring them because yeah, it's the image of Stan's head in there. Of course, that's going to freak them out. But then, like I said, he just mocks. He just gets under their skin, and that's what he's really trying to do, more so than what he did when they were kids. So yeah, there's things where you can see why they went the directions they did, but you also kind of think there's a perfectly good reason it was that way in the book also. But I am a fan of a lot of the changes they made, because I don't think they take away from the book at all, but actually almost hit the points home even more, and not in a way that feels overbearing. So I'm really good with those. And then, of course, you get the more character-driven scenes, like when Bill's the first one to get there, so he and Mike, the whole segment where Mike, found Silver and then the whole fix him up and all that. Instead of the whole sending Bill to the pawn shop, because, once again, time constraints. But I do think it's kind of a nice idea that Mike just had it. Honestly, and then the whole scene where we get them catching back up, it's a little cheesy with the soundtrack and all that, but it's still really nice. And the way they have the cutting back and forth between them as kids and them as adults, and even Richard Thomas doing his dorky little motion when Mike succeeds going over the seesaw. It's all very, very endearing. And also talking about some of the lighter moments, we have Ritchie's comedic lines, obviously, which, to my understanding, was mostly Harry Anderson improving, which makes perfect sense, because you can kind of tell it's almost like a lot of the comics feel off the cuff, and it's like some of them will land, some of them won't, just like it would be if you knew Ritchie personally. It's like the drunker they are, the funnier the jokes are to them, even if they're not really. So I felt like all of that stuff feels really human also. That the moment when he tries to tell them about the rhyme, and he's just horribly stuttering through it and saying it was supposed to help. Just the way his head comes into frame, and he's like, I gotta tell you, buddy, it's not helping. Stuff like that really lands well and really works. I also love his comment to Eddie once they're down in the sewer when he confesses to being a virgin his whole life, and he's like, well, I can't help you with that, buddy, but thanks for sharing. The stuff like that really does work, even if it, like I said, I feel like it's intentionally sometimes on and off. And makes Ritchie more human and not necessarily just the comedy relief. We can see in him, we can see the panic in him, that it's like, that the humor's more of a defense mechanism than it is, oh, this is the comedy character. Like, even when it gets to the moment when he says at the end, before they go in, like, what are you going to do next, sing Kumbaya? And it's like, that's, in the moment, that's really funny, but you can also see it's coming out of his fear, like, the more he does that, so, yeah, I thought that was really well done. And then the addition of somebody I didn't mention in the last video was Olivia Hussey, of all people, playing Audra. And I do sort of, I think she's good casting also because of the whole idea, and I kind of like that they never mention it, but you can somewhat get the vibe of it if you know to look for it. The idea that, the whole idea of Bill marrying Audra is that she's like a dead ringer for Bev. And it's like, you can kind of see the similarities between Olivia Hussey and Annette O'Toole when you really look at it. And like I said, you know that sort of part of it that they never really go into. And yeah, so it's like, it's weird to see her as like this really sort of known actress in like this really small part in this. Especially if you're like a Romeo and Juliet fan, so or a Psycho 4 fan or whatever. And then there are the moments where, like I said, we're getting closer to the climax, so things are going to have to ramp up a little bit, but also the humanity has to be there more than ever also. And there are a couple of ways they handle this that I really love. And it's like, say what you will about the, I guess you could say, inconsistent performances throughout this. But there are two moments in this that are really good and really take us to the climax. One involves no words spoken, and one involves a monologue. The first one being after they've killed Henry Bowers and they're leaving the townhouse or whatever. And it's like they decided, like, maybe we're not going to do this, or like we should, things are getting a little too, we almost lost Mike, we already know what Stan's fate is, maybe we shouldn't do this, maybe we should get the hell out of here and leave this behind. Hopefully our memories get erased again. But then there's that moment where Ritchie is the one that's been standing out the most saying, nope, I'm not going there. Like, he was ready to go once they were finished at the Chinese restaurant. If the fortune cookie thing hadn't happened, Ritchie would have been on a plane and gone. And he's the one always saying, we're not going to do this. This stuff that you have, the helmets and shit, the flashlights, just no, we're not doing that whatsoever. And then the thing where we really see him change in this movie, even though he's still extremely opposed to going down there, all the way up to them going in, there's that moment where just as he's leaving the room, he sees the news on, and there's another little girl that's been killed. And just the way that it's like, you can almost see him coming to terms with the fact that somebody has to put an end to this. Like, they cannot just leave this behind, and for more of those news stories to happen. And he just does that without words, and we can just see, like, a whole new side of him, like, oh shit, we're really gonna have to do this. And it's like, because we're gonna be terrible people if we walk away from this knowing we're the only ones that can probably do anything about it. And then we double down on that when we get outside, and Bill has his monologue. And there's a thing here that they sort of try to capture, like showing us stuff, but I think it's actually better captured in Bill's speech here. I'm talking about the "Kiss Me Fat Boy" scene, where we get the whole thing where Ben goes in the other room, and then Bev comes in, and it's Pennywise. And then when Bev's actually being genuine with him and confessing she knew it was him that wrote the poem, Ben's not sure what the hell to believe. And I get what they're going with that, but I don't know if it quite hits home hard enough. I don't know if it's the performances or the presentation of it or what. But I think that idea is brought forth a lot more the way Bill sees the woman playing the piano, and the way he just comes out and just says, like, I just saw something and I don't even know if it was real or not, and I'm not going to be able to live with that, and I just can't. And that whole monologue, I think, is really good and really builds it. Like, it's a really believable way to get all of them to kind of fall in line and say, yeah, we do need to do this. We know that Ritchie's pretty much already there, begrudgingly, but this kind of really, takes it into that everybody knows what they have to do. And the way the editing helpfully shows us that it pretty much mirrors the scene when they were children, when Bill, like, begged them for help. And so I thought that was just really beautifully done, and a really great way to take us into the climax. So obviously, once again, now we've got to do the climax of it on a TV budget. Best of luck to you. So what they come up with here is, I do like that we get one more glimpse of Pennywise. I've always loved, shoddy as the effect may be, I really always love, like, one of my favorite moments, I think, in the movie is Pennywise's last monologue. Where he's just like this, projected image on the wall or whatever. But even so, regardless of the effect itself, this is another one of those cases where Curry's performance really goes above. And the way he's saying, you're not only are you never going to beat me, but trying to beat me, you're going to completely lose your mind. Like, you're just going to go into this dark place, and you're going to be in the deadlights. And you just, every single word, every single delivery of every word in that monologue is so good. And just really this big, and it's like, it really goes out on a high note in regards to when we actually see Pennywise as Pennywise. So of course, obviously, with that, on top of just everything else, yeah, a lot of people find the ending very underwhelming, as they often do with King's stories that involve a monster of sorts or whatever. That King comes to the conclusion that there's going to have to be some sort of final confrontation, and they need something to confront. And we gotta go bigger than the clown, because they beat the clown as kids, but Pennywise is now pissed off, he wants revenge, he's gotta go larger. And if you read the book, Pennywise is also scared, like, for the first time ever. Because he knows if he can be beat by anybody, they're right in front of him now. So we get the spider. And the thing about the spider is that what's interesting about it is it's one of those cases where you would think, when you see it and you see, like, the spider puppet and all that, you sort of think, oh, the book must have done something a lot more outrageous, and it's like, oh, they had a TV budget, so they're like, let's just make it a spider, because we can do that. There's a spider prop in the back of the lot somewhere. It's like, no, that was always the story. It was a giant spider. It never goes in the series, it never goes into the fact that it was female and had a bunch of eggs, setting up a whole lot of possibilities there that we don't even want to think about. Of if those eggs were to hatch, how many of these there would be. But the fact that they really didn't have much they could do, Even the director said that he's not crazy about the climax. And there are some things here where I think they helped in other cases where it's like there's constraints to an issue. Take out stuff like effects, like when Bev shoots it in the deadlights with the earring, and it's like just stock footage of fireworks or whatever the fuck that is. But apart from that, there are some things that are like, there's stuff that obviously they were never going to be able to do. Obviously the ritual was never going to be here, because how do you do that? I think the closest we get is Bill being hypnotized by the deadlights, but I think that's really all it's implying that happened, is he's hypnotized by the deadlights and being pulled in. Same with Ritchie and Ben when they run up to him. So, yeah, so really it just becomes a physical fight, nothing to do with the universes or anything like that. There's no turtles present here, no godlike turtles present here. So, and I think another thing that makes the ending feel underwhelming, especially if you've read the book, is the way that you think, like, oh, one climax, you know, is better because they, you know, really actually fight the clown and all that, and it's more, almost seems like more personal. And then in this one, they obviously had to go bigger because the threat's bigger and they're older and all that, and it's more afraid than it's ever been. And the fact that we kind of get this in that order, whereas in the book, it's going back and forth, like flashbacks to present day, over and over again. So in the book, we're getting both finales simultaneously, and it feels enormous. And of course, you add the storm into that also, which adds this whole sort of below and above, just destruction fucking everywhere. They were never ever going to do that on a TV budget. There was just no way. It's got to be they fight the spider puppet at the end. That's all they can do. And there's one thing here that I actually like that they did. That's not something the book did, which is, obviously their number is narrowed down even more because Eddie is killed. Now, of course, he initially got his arm ripped off, and he, like, bled out and all that other stuff. I think he may have gotten stuck somewhere else at one point. But in this, once again, only so much you can show on TV, even if they were pushing an envelope at the time. I'm guessing where he just picks Eddie up and then drops him. I'm guessing with how long it held on to him, we're supposed to assume that he was, like, squeezed to death or something, maybe like an internal thing or something, because there's nothing physically on him. And then he just passes on. And then there's the idea of all the ones left standing. Because we got Stan dead, we have Eddie dead, and Mike is out of commission. So we've only got these left. Now, of course, the book, they all have their different tasks. Bev stays behind with Eddie. Ben takes care of the eggs, and it's Bill and Ritchie going after it physically. But the thing that I kind of like about this that the series does is the idea of all of them going after it physically. It's where it's like, the eggs thing is something like really foreboding in a way that's like terrifying to think about the consequences. So it all does feel like they're doing something really crucial. But just the image of all four, regardless of how fake it looks, just the image of all the remaining Losers Club just physically attacking it all at once, I think is a really cool idea. Which, like I said, in TV movies, you're not always going to get the perfect execution of the idea. But the idea is there, and I really love the idea. But yes, so that's where we end up. And then there is the last thing where the series kind of gives us a somewhat of a bittersweet, and I'm really using that term loosely, a bittersweet thing here about Eddie. Where it's like, the whole thing is that they have no choice in the book but to leave Eddie in the sewer, the very last place he would want to be left, and it's like this whole moral dilemma, and it's really heart-wrenching. It's like the idea of Eddie having been there, and, you know, they all love each other in ways that they haven't before. Even Eddie mentions that in the series, and he's like, the only people I've ever loved is them. And the gut-wrenching decision to have to leave him behind in the fucking sewer is just one of the absolute most heartbreaking things in the book. And at the end, when they all come out, everybody has somebody. Bill has Audra in her particular state. You have Ben and Bev together, and then you have Eddie over Ritchie's shoulders. And it's like, it's almost like, you could say it's a cop-out and they didn't want to go the more heart-wrenching way or whatever. But it does almost feel like it sort of gives the book at least a somewhat bittersweet moment there for the book readers, where it's like, oh, they didn't have to leave Eddie behind. But that just sort of depends on how far you think they should go and how much emotion you want them to put in it. So obviously, there's a lot more emotion they could have put in this that they kind of went around a little bit. But once again, it's really all about the time constraints. That's the fucking bummer of being a TV movie, but it happens. So yes, and then finally, we kind of speed through the process of. This is kind of where we touch on the idea of it kind of starts to occur to maybe viewers who haven't read the book. It's like, oh, it's as far as them being in Derry and out of Derry in regards to what they remember and what they remember about each other. And then it kind of eventually gets to him waking Audra up by beating the devil again, which he mentions like really quickly in off-screen dialogue, which is like a whole thing in the book that makes a lot more sense than to say a viewer, it was like, oh, you brought her out of it because you took her off for a bike ride, alright. So it's like there is some stuff that has trouble translating, but it is nice that it's still in there for the people that really do know the story. But yeah, so overall, like I was saying, I do think its reputation could be a lot better than it is because of how genuinely good of an adaptation it really is with the so many constraints that they had. Being a TV movie, only being able to show so much in such a certain amount of time. It's like I was saying, like, when you first see the movie, you think 3 hours is a long time, and it's like there is so much that's not here, and the stuff that's not here only makes the story even richer, but they still managed to put a lot of the points across and hit a lot of those effective moments, even with the constraints. So I've always thought this was perfectly fine as an adaptation, and I think it's going to perfectly coexist with both the new movie and its sequel that comes out tomorrow, if you're seeing this on time, which I'll be seeing first thing in the morning, and then I'll be doing that video right after that, and I'll get more into that stuff, the more existential stuff in the book, because that's stuff it's stuff that's here, but it's kind of glossed over because it's that hour and a half that we only have is wrapping up. But I'm really hoping, and I'm confident in the runtime of the sequel and the fact that a lot of the critics apparently in the early reviews are bitching about its length, and it's like that's probably because they really deal with the existential thing after it has been beat, which is something I'm really looking forward to. I'm really looking forward to being emotionally beat the shit by the new movie tomorrow. So yeah, and like I said, but between this, like having, a lot of the same dialogue and a lot of the scenes intact, where I thought that the new movies kind of dealt more with the feeling of just sort of fear in general, like the two of them together are going to kind of just we'll feel like we have an almost full on-the-screen adaptation of this story. This story that is just absolutely monumental in size and scope and all that, and emotion, in terror, like I said, whether it's terror that characters feel or you feel reading or watching it. And to me, it's always been, it might be my favorite book, not just my favorite King book, but I do think, I know a lot of people will go towards like The Shining or the Dark Tower series, but I personally think it might be like his magnum opus, to me anyway. So, because it's like everything in his stories just all rolled into one, telling this really just massive story that we can all relate to in ways, whether it be, first love, like the way he describes the way the Losers Club feels about Bev, I'm sure we all felt about some girl in our childhood. Then there's the fear, some things that seem totally irrational, which, like I said, is the whole, it depends on the character in regards to who's scared of and who's going to relate to what when they're taking it in as a consumer. So yeah, it's really just, yeah, like I said before, I just really love the story. I love whenever I start into it, whether I watch, the new movie again, or this again, or start reading the book again, I just get consumed by this story for long periods of time. To the point that I almost feel like the characters themselves feel like characters you, know personally. And it's, yeah. So, so as an adaptation, I've always been a really big fan of this, but I do love that the new movies are also giving us a lot of the stuff that wasn't there before and giving it in this bigger, grander way, and really being able to go all in without the constraints of, you know, being made for TV and having like the, you can only say this stuff, you can only show this stuff, and the fact that the movies are clearly really breaking down those barriers. So yeah, so I just think the whole thing, like anything talking about this story, is exciting to me. So whether it be made for TV or theatrical or whatever, I just love it. I just take it all in. So I think that's going to be it for this. So as I said, I'll be talking about the new movie tomorrow. I'm seeing it first thing in the morning, and I could not be more fucking psyched about it. And then the review video I kind of forgot about that I could have done this past week, like with The Farewell and Them That Follow and stuff like that. It'll be the day after, and then after that will be another Versus, and then we'll go through September. So until all of that stuff, I think that's it for this.